It's Podathon week on the Big Sky Astrology Podcast. And for 5 big days in a row, we're bringing you special episodes that put the fun in fundraising, including the week's planetary news, a closer look at the moon, and special Podathon surprises. Plus, your chance to win prizes, people. So many prizes. And now, here's your host, astrologer and author, April Elliott Kent.
Hello, invisible friend. April here, and the date today is September 2nd, 2025. Welcome to episode 307 of the Big Sky Astrology Podcast, and welcome to day 2 of the 6th annual Big Sky Astrology Podathon. This is the week each year when I bring you 5 daily episodes, complete with the big astrological news of the week. And this week, interviews with 5 fantastic astrologers, each from a different astrological specialty. Of course, this is also the week when I make my appeal for donations, which help me cover the costs of producing the podcast for the entire year ahead. While I do my best to run an economical podcast, there are costs associated with producing this weekly show, and I would rather turn to my listeners to help me cover those costs than to take on advertising. So many of the podcasts I listen to have had to turn to an advertising-heavy model that really interferes with the flow of the shows and with my enjoyment of them. And I am going to assume that many of you feel the same. And so once a year during Labor Day week, I give you Podathon. And then the rest of the year, we don't have to talk about fundraising. You can make a one-time donation in any amount or become a regular monthly contributor just by going to bigskyastropod.com. And to encourage your contributions, here are this year's fantastic giveaways. First, everyone who donates $25 or more, as well as our ongoing monthly PodPal contributors, will be entered in a drawing to win one of these 5 prizes. One grand prize winner will win a 90-minute reading with me. That's a $275 value. 2 lucky listeners will win a 60-minute personal astrology reading with me. That's a $215 value. And 3 lucky donors will win a copy of my Followed by a Moon Shadow Eclipse Report, a $35 value. And that's going to help you get ready for this month's eclipses as well. To be entered in the drawing, you need to make your $25 donation at bigskyastropod.com no later than midnight Pacific time on Monday, September 8th. The drawing will be held on September 9th, and winners will be notified by email. But let's say you can't donate that much. I'm also offering donors of only $10 or more a special bonus, a series of private YouTube videos for donors only. Over the past year that I've been offering this, donors and I have met virtually for most new moons, going in depth on big planetary transits and the symbolism of the new moon. And if you really can't contribute financially at all, I completely understand. It has been a little bit of a tricky year so far, and many of us are holding on to our pennies. Here are a few easy, free ways you can show your love and support for the podcast. Please subscribe or follow the show on your app of choice. This is the very best way you can support the show and help it get seen by other listeners. You could leave a 5-star rating or write a review either on Apple Podcasts or any of the other platforms that allow comments. These might inspire other people to give the show a chance. And finally, recommend the show to an astrology-loving friend. However you choose to show your appreciation, please know that I'm deeply grateful. And now for today's episode. In this week's special daily episodes, I'm covering the week's major astrological news, along with an interview with a fellow astrologer, each of whom is practicing in a particular astrological specialty: Hellenistic astrology, evolutionary, psychological, astrocartography. And today I'm speaking with my warm and knowledgeable San Diego colleague, Kenneth Miller, about his astrological specialty, Vedic astrology. But first, let's take a look at today's planetary news. It's a little bit of a quiet day, but Mercury enters Virgo today at 6:23 a.m. Pacific time. And Virgo is one of Mercury's very strongest signs. It'll be there for a relatively brief stay, though. It enters Libra on September 18th. Mercury is the planet of communication, and when it's in Virgo, it's especially adept at analysis, editing, and also making informed choices. It's a perceptive placement for Mercury, and we're able to catch details we might normally overlook. If you are in business, it's a good transit for updating your office systems, breaking in new software, or hiring help. Mercury is a planet that's associated with business, so it's a good time to be doing all of those things. And at home, it's a good time to get your animals to the vet for their checkups, get your own annual exam, catch up on dental work, take your car in for maintenance, organize your closet. Virgo is excellent for all of these things. And on this day, Mercury is supported by the moon in Capricorn, which makes a trine aspect to the sun in Virgo at 3:23 p.m. So we have a good flowing energy for the entire day to work on matters of a practical nature, as well as making long-term plans. As you know, during this Podathon week, I'm bringing you interviews with 5 of my colleagues, each of whom will tell us about their particular astrological specialty. Today's interview is with Vedic astrologer Kenneth Miller. Here is our conversation. My guest today is Kenneth Miller, M.A. He is a certified consulting astrologer living here in San Diego, California. We are neighbors, roughly. He is a lifelong student of astrology, and he has been practicing professionally for over 20 years. He's a graduate of Kepler College and the American College of Vedic Astrology. He has served on the national boards of ESAR and CVA, and locally on the board of NCGR. He is the president emeritus of Kepler College and the San Diego Astrological Society. He has lectured on astrological topics all over the world, and I have always found Kenneth to be a really good intermediary between Vedic and Western astrology. So I'm especially happy that you were able to join us today to speak about it, Kenneth. It is a delight to welcome you to my podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm excited to be whatever kind of bridge I can be to increase understanding.
For listeners who are more accustomed to Western astrology, which I figure are most of them on this podcast, what do you think is the biggest difference that they will notice when they look at a Vedic chart for the first time?
Well, a couple of things. In Western astrology, we basically have 3 different chart formats. We have the pie slices in a circle, which is probably the most dominant one. If you're into, Uranian or cosmobiology, you're using a dial, also with vibrational astrology. And then if you're doing like medieval or Renaissance astrology, you might have a square chart with triangles in it. if you're, doing it lily style or the style of the period. So in Indian astrology, there are there's a bunch, it turns out, of different chart styles, but there are two dominant ones, what they call the North Indian chart style, which looks visually quite similar to the medieval square chart of Western astrology, and then the South Indian, which is a square with little squares in it, which is what I use. So visually, you're going to be like, wait, where's the pie? What am I doing looking in these little boxes? So every box is going to be a sign or a house. And then I think another visual thing is that, again, depending on the astrologer, you're going to see letter abbreviations for the planets instead of glyphs. The glyphs are used in Western astrology. They've been used a long, long time in Western astrology. But in Indian astrology, where often you were drawing the chart on a chalkboard or some temporary surface, you would just put the initials of the planets in their proper places. You're also going to find, again, depending on the astrologer, an absence of Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, asteroid points, stuff like that. And you may find other things that are unique to Vedic astrology put in the chart, depending on the astrologer. But I think that's what confronts you when you're looking at the chart. And especially the South Indian chart goes clockwise. If you pull up your Western chart and you think about it, the houses go counterclockwise. And so that is a bit of a shift in thinking when you go to a South Indian chart. Now, the North Indian chart will also go counterclockwise, but it will put the ascendant at the top instead of off to the side. And with a South Indian chart, you're looking for either the word ascendant, the word lagna, which is often abbreviated LG, which is simply the Sanskrit word for ascendant, or there'll be two little lines telling you where the ascendant is. So those are what is going to confront someone visually when they look at the chart.
I'm trying to remember, are the aspects drawn between planets, or is it more the association of one house to another?
There are aspects, they are different. They're typically not drawn in, I'm not familiar of any software that draws in the aspects. You may do that as you're prepping for the reading or looking at the chart, just to kind of oh, this is aspecting this. In Indian astrology, aspecting a house is just as important as aspecting a planet. So you kind of make note of where everyone's gaze is going. It's a different set of aspects. The rules are a little bit different, but you won't see them typically drawn in. That will be just something you bring to the table as an astrologer. The other thing someone will notice is that their planetary positions will have changed, because the vast majority of Vedic astrologers use the sidereal zodiac, which is simply starting the beginning of Aries from a particular point in the sky, as opposed to the seasons like we do in the West.
What that usually gives you is an offset of about 22 degrees or something?
Depending on when you were born, 22 to 24 at this point. And it's changing because the Earth wobbles. And so when horoscopic astrology was invented, weirdly, around that time, the star zodiac and the seasonal zodiac lined up.
Mm-hmm.
For a while, people didn't know exactly what was going on. There was a theory, one Greek theory was, maybe it goes a little bit in one direction and then it goes in the other direction. We don't really know what's going on, but it clearly is moving year to year. But Western Hellenistic astrologers made the decision to, we're going to tie, Ptolemy, we're going to tie it to the seasons. That's going to be our zodiac. And the Indians, who are a sky watching culture from way back, tied it to the sky.
So just to explain to listeners who may be a little more to beginning level, for example, if in their Western chart, they have the sun at 20 degrees Leo, then when they look at their Vedic chart in the sidereal zodiac, it's going to be at the very end of Cancer.
Correct.
And that's a big difference in style.
That is a big difference. And just, before someone switches off this interview because they're in disgust, the planets mean different things in the two systems. But that's really the simple answer of how you can have a moon that makes sense both in the West and in the East.
Vedic astrology seems to have acquired a reputation, rightly or wrongly, for being very predictive. predictive. Do you think that that's true? And how would it affect the kinds of questions that you would explore in a reading or the way you would explore them?
I might lose sight of the second part of that question, so bring it back up if I don't get to it. But first of all, I think to understand that question, you have to understand the cultural context of Indian astrology versus modern Western astrology. Because if you go back, Hellenistic astrology, as it was practiced back then in Indian astrology, also very predictive. Now, this is my analysis. I'm not saying this is definitely a fact, but from me thinking about it and looking at it, I believe that here in America, for example, or in the West, particularly in America, where we're taught you can be anything, you can do anything, you have like free will, you just need enough gumption, whether that's true or not, we can debate. But if you have enough gumption, you can accomplish any task. But there is a real loss or absence of meaning for soul. And so when the astrological revival happened in the West, there were a lot of questions about meaning. Who am I? What am I? And people would go to astrologers to ask, but they still do. Young people still go to astrologers asking those questions. In India, they tend to know who they are. Their ability until very recently to get out of current circumstances or to climb a social ladder was rare. So if there was a certain opportunity that was going to present itself, you wanted to know that and you wanted to grab it. So I think it's the cultures that sort of inform this difference, where Vedic astrology has a reputation of predicting events because I think out of the box, Indian astrology is observing life from what I call the movie camera point of view. And modern Western astrology, it's more of how are you perceiving things and how are you reacting to the world within that cultural context of, hey, I can do whatever I want, but I don't know who I am, versus I know who I am, but I need to know exactly when to do what to like maximize my chances of success. Now, I do believe that both astrologies can do both. I mean, you can actually do a really interesting psychological reading with Vedic astrology. It's just that Indians typically don't ask for that. And by the time a Westerner finds Indian astrology, they're usually not particularly interested in that. They're wanting me to describe their life. So in terms of how that informs the questions that are asked of the chart, every astrologer is different, as you can attest. My personal style is to be very client focused. So I usually do a little pre-interview, either via email or over the phone before the session, to get an idea of like, why are they coming to me? What do they want to know? If it's because they have a bunch of decisions to make and they kind of need to know that movie camera view, then that's how I will read the chart. If they're very confused about who they are, or they have spiritual questions about themselves, then I will take that tact. Just as I think you can take Western astrology and make it do both, depending on the person coming.
Why do you think it is most clients will seek you out as a Vedic astrologer, even if they don't have a lot of familiarity with that system? What is it that draws them, do you think, about the Vedic style?
I've never asked my clients that question, so I will just be guessing here. But I think it's several factors. I think people who are consumers of astrology or astro enthusiasts, we have this culture where we're constantly looking for the new thing that's going to make us the best astrologer ever. And if you look at the astrological lecture circuit, you'll see it's, let's look at this one thing that's really going to change everything you know about astrology. And if we look at the UX schedule, it's going to be full of all these very specific techniques because we want to learn the new thing. Maybe this will make me, the very best astrologer I can be. So Vedic astrology is just another new thing that you might be able to incorporate. I think too, I have had clients who have had a bunch of Western readings and they just want something different. Maybe they want to challenge themselves. Sometimes they'll just want to know, how can I possibly be both a Taurus moon and a Aries moon at the same time?
Well, can you talk a little bit about the moon in Vedic astrology? Because it really seems to be emphasized in a way Western astrology seems to really focus on the sun, for example. The moon seems to loom really large in Vedic astrology. Can you just talk a little bit about that role of the moon and how they might offer a different way of looking at the chart or a different kind of insight?
So just to clarify, there's another way one can divide the sky, and that is into lunar mansions. And Western astrology and Chinese astrology has lunar mansions where they basically divide the lunar cycle into discrete periods. If we were to go out tonight and look at the moon and anchor it in relationship to a star, if we came back in 27 days, the moon would be back in the same position in relation to that star. It's actually 27.3 days. That is the nakshatra wheel, and that's the Vedic Sanskrit word for the lunar mansions, the nakshatras. And it's basically the moon is in a different nakshatra every day, approximately. And this is the earliest strata of Indian astrology. The ancient Vedic rituals were timed based on what nakshatra, what stars. They're like tiny constellations that are based on tiny groups of stars. And they're all associated with ancient Vedic deities, many of which, if you're not familiar, you will have never heard of. They're not like the big ones that are common in Hinduism now. And the earliest strata of Indian astrology was tracking the moon in relation to the stars. Very easy to do. You look at the night sky, you track where the moon is, what's happening. As horoscopic astrology was developed in India, the moon became a very important focal point because in Indian astrology, the moon is the mind. The entire mind and perceptual field, in my understanding of Indian astrology, is represented by the moon. In the West, we tend to throw, emotions and, the moon is kind of like the younger, more core being of yourself. We tend to think of it in a psychodynamic kind of way and representing whatever. But in Indian astrology, it's like your whole perceptual field and how you see things. And that's important. So it has primary importance in Indian astrology. And these nakshatras have meaning in a couple of different ways. They're not the Indian version of sun signs, although you can find plenty of published material that contradicts what I'm saying. When Indian astrology was brought over to the West, it was like, the traditional literature would have like 2 sentences describing the personality of someone who is born in a particular nakshatra. And those 2-sentence descriptions typically don't make sense to modern people. You'll find what Varamihira wrote in 500 CE, and you'll read the 2 little sentences. You'll be like, well, that doesn't sound like me at all. But modern astrologers have kind of developed and, written pages about what this means for your personality. That's all kind of a modern innovation and may be helpful. I'm not saying it's not helpful. It's just not part of the tradition. The tradition is every nakshatra is connected to a deity. And if you're born in a certain nakshatra, that is to say your moon is in a certain nakshatra, that deity's mythology and story may be relevant for you and often is. So for example, an easy one is the very beginning of Leo, sidereal Leo, the first 13 degrees and 20 minutes, is the nakshatra Magha, which is ruled by the Pitris or the ancestors. And so people whose moon is there, they may literally have an interest in their own ancestors, but typically they'll have an interest in history, getting to the root of things, like finding out what actually really happened. And I find that's really informative. I will look up, if I don't already know, the deity of a particular nakshatra, refresh my memory of the stories, and usually that will be relevant to the person's life. The other way nakshatras are used, they have an electional astrology component where they tell you the quality of the day. And so if you're needing to do something and, you're trying to elect a time with Western astrology and you can't find a good time, but you absolutely have to do it this week, you could check on the moon nakshatras and find a favorable nakshatra to your thing. One of my teachers explained it as the moon's nakshatra of the day. It's good for like growing things because the moon is kind of associated with growth. So its impact is in like growing something. Now, some things you don't want to grow. There are nakshatras that are not particularly good for most things. And in fact, today, we might just be transitioning out of it. But when we started this, we were in the nakshatra of Ardra today, which is one of the more negative sounding ones. It is connected with like dissolution and letting go of things. That's good. But traditionally, it has a kind of causing harm and pain. Like it would be a good one to go to war during an Ardra day, all things. But in modern times, if you were like cleaning away clutter, it would be a good day for that, getting rid of things. Or if it's considered like a good day for surgery if all of the things agree with it, because there you're kind of inflicting pain for a good cause, that is getting better or eliminating the thing. So they're all, and then these nakshatras are also connected to one of the planets, one of the traditional planets of Indian astrology, of which there are 9, the 7 that plus the North Node and the South Node, called Rahu and Ketu. That's another difference. You'll always see the North Node and South Node in an Indian chart. I notice even like the default setting for solar fire, we'll put like the North Node out, but not the South Node. You got to go in and turn that on.
And add it to your list.
But in Indian astrology, you'll always see those because they're considered very important. And that's probably the most different in meaning between East and West are the nodes. Very different.
I hope you can tell us just a little bit about that, because my listeners are very interested in the nodes. And how would you summarize that? We tend to see them as the South Node is more about letting go of things, and the North Node is about trying to grow in a particular direction. How would Vedic astrology see it?
A little bit different than that. And first of all, let me say, I am a believer that all astrologies are good, potentially. It's really the astrologer. Find a good astrologer and whatever they're doing is going to help you probably. So it's not about which one is better or which one is right. I absolutely feel if you're using a Western chart, you need to use the Western notion of nodes to make sense. If you try to bring that over to the Vedic side or vice versa, it's not going to compute, in my opinion. And here we go. So in Indian astrology, there's a story, which will take too long to tell, but basically there's one being that gets his head chopped off right after he becomes immortal. And that head becomes Rahu, or the North Node, and the tail section, or really the whole body section, becomes Ketu, or the South Node. That head, because it's disembodied and doesn't have a stomach, becomes a insatiable kind of energy. So Rahu is a very ambitious energy. It always wants more. It is seen as malefic out of the box in Indian astrology as it's practiced in India. I find in America, where more is better, and that's kind of our philosophy, it usually just shows ambition. It shows like cutting edge, pushing the boundaries. It sometimes indicates rejecting the norms of your family. Like often if Rahu's in the 9th house, you will reject the religion of your parents, which was seen as a terrible, terrible thing, in traditional India. But for us, no big deal. It's the Jew that goes into Buddhism, or, the Christian that becomes an atheist. It's just, there's some kind of, you're going outside the norm. And Rahu energy tends to make us go a little farther than we should. So I remember I had a client early on in my career who was in a Rahu period. That is a time of his life where Rahu was highly energized, and he was in the TV business. He was working on a project that was making, so he told me, $1 million a day, but it was costing him like $1.1 million. And that's Rahu. It's like Rahu just makes you take that extra thing on that you probably shouldn't, that then becomes a problem for you. And with Rahu, a lot of it is learning to kind of like, okay, I'll go to the cliff to get a good view, but I won't take that extra step, so I'm falling off the cliff. Rahu will like amp up whatever planet it's next to. At the same time, it will take on qualities of if it's conjunct a planet, it will take on the qualities of the planet that it's next to too. So that adds a whole nother layer of like everyone's node is different depending on what's there. Ketu is a creative and spiritualizing influence, often perceived as malefic, because Ketu is, when do you pray to God? Is it the day after you won the lottery or the day before? Day after, no, you never do that. But Ketu will be like, oh, you need to like take an appraisal of your life. If you're not doing that, I'll start taking things away. So in that sense, it is a planet of kind of letting go. It's having a planet often when K2 turns on and is dominant. If you don't have like a spiritual practice or a creative practice, a place for that to manifest, it will manifest as taking things away until you become a little more serious about those topics. I only really worry about K2. Well, actually, there's a lot of reasons to worry about everything. But when I have like a business client that has no spiritual practice, they're not interested in that. They're using astrology simply to augment their worldly success. K2 can be a bit of a rascal because it will, start to be like, there are more important things than that. And you may need to like realign values. But you also see it in the charts of artists and stuff like that. It's very, again, without that ego, it's very creative. A lot of inspiration comes through. So I look at it as a kind of spiritualizing influence in the chart. And it too is influenced by a planet that it's with. So you can have all kinds of Rahus and Ketus depending on if they're in the same house as another planet.
I mean, just as a sidebar of that, because the nodes are so associated with eclipses, how are eclipses viewed in Vedic astrology?
Eclipses are complicated. I'm actually longer than I'd like to admit. I've been working on a class because a lot of my clients will reach out during eclipse season in a panic. And it's a lot more nuanced in the classic literature. And a lot of it, you kind of have to wait until it happens because they take into account visual phenomenon of the eclipse itself to add to the interpretation. But yes, the reason why the nodes are considered kind of malefic out the gate is they are eclipse points. And what is an eclipse? An eclipse is either the sun goes dark and it becomes sort of a pseudo nighttime and the animals freak out and it feels really weird. Now, in modern times, we celebrate it and it's like a marvel of nature. And so I think that's had an effect on how eclipses manifest for personal charts. But yeah, you do pay attention to it. Lunar eclipse, you're all excited for the full moon and then suddenly it disappears under the eclipse. So partial eclipses, slight eclipses, I find in modern YouTube astrology, any eclipse gets a lot of press because you're having to generate content and what can I do? Even if the eclipse is just slightly covering a little bit, some astrologers will make a big deal about it and get you all afraid about it. In Indian astrology, it's like if the light is there and a lot of the light is there, that's a whole different kettle of fish because eclipses are really about the absence of light. So if you've just got one of these eclipses that's covering, 20% of the moon where you can barely see it with the naked eye, that's going to be much, much less dramatic than a full lunar eclipse.
Is there anything more that you would like to share that I have not thought to ask you about?
I'll just end with this, and that is that the model behind Indian astrology is a karma and reincarnation or rebirth model. And what I mean by that is, according to most Indian astrology, Hindu-based Indian astrology, they will say that you've lived several lives and that you've generated a whole bunch of karma. Of that karma, a certain portion is allotted to this life. That portion is represented by the birth chart. So when people say, oh, where do I find karma in the chart? Is it in the south node? Well, no, it's in the whole chart. That whole chart is kind of your karmic map for this life and how it unfolds in time. And I think one of the valuable things I found about Indian astrology and what attracted me to it is its unbroken tradition, unlike Western astrology, where it's just been part of the culture. It's been accepted by the culture. It's had a consistency of language. And so you have this nice, rich tradition, which you can bring over here and it can be meaningful to us Westerners.
Where can people find you? And tell us what you have coming up.
People can find me on my website. You can sign up on my mailing list, which means you will rarely hear from me. I don't do like a regular weekly thing. Okay. It's usually only when I'm appearing somewhere or starting a class. It would be like a couple times a year. So very low impact on your inbox. But you can find me at Kenneth D, as in delightful, Miller, .com. You can also find me at celestialintelligencer.net or com, if you can spell that, celestial, and then the word intelligence with an R at the end. You can put Kenneth Miller Astrologer in Google and you'll find me, and also a bunch of YouTube videos that I've done over the years. Upcoming, I am teaching in November. I'm doing a lecture at the Connecticut Astrological Group, whose name I should know, but I don't remember right this second. That's online. And then next year I am appearing at UAC, which will be the big international conference in Chicago. And I'll also be at Lilydale, New York, for their astrology week. I don't think they've started promoting that yet, but I'll be doing kind of a whole day of kind of a how to read a chart.
And before I let you go,
yeah,
what are your favorite resources to recommend to people who are just curious about Vedic astrology and want to learn more, whether it's books or classes or what it might be?
Well, like all astrology, 2 astrologers, 3 opinions. So realize that everyone's going to have a slightly different take. I think the synastry between you as the potential student and the astrologer is very important. What I found to be particularly helpful may not be helpful to you. I've had students that have enjoyed my work, but they have read books that I would have never recommended because I think they're, crazy. But it spoke to them. And it helped them get to where they need to be. I think the books of James Kelleher and James Braha are a good introduction. But really, again, if you have a local bookstore that has an astrology section, probably doesn't have any Vedic books. So you'll have to go online and see if you can download a sample, like Amazon, for example, lets you do, and kind of like, does this speak to you? There's a lot of YouTube stuff out there. I think it's really about finding someone that you have a rapport with, and then listening to them teach. And then, are you actually learning? Because some people can be very charismatic, but then you realize, wait, I have no idea how to read a chart. And I've been, studying this for X amount of time. I also think my pet peeve that you're better to learn from an astrologer who is still seeing clients, because I've noticed in the Vedic world, at least, that when people retire from doing client work and they just teach full time, they start to separate from reality and they start teaching stuff that doesn't actually work in the day-to-day practice. My opinion might not apply to everyone, but I think that it's helpful to learn from someone who's actually in the trenches.
Wonderful. And Kenneth, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I think people are really going to get a lot out of it. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, that is everything on my show sheet, so I'm going to wrap this one up. Thanks so much to Kenneth Miller for that fascinating look at Vedic astrology. And thank you so much for listening to the Big Sky Astrology podcast and joining me for the second episode of this 6th annual Podathon. This weekly podcast is audience funded, and your generous donations help me keep the podcast coming to you ad-free. To make your donation, please go to bigskyastropod.com. And anyone who donates $10 or more or becomes a monthly contributor will receive access to a series of private YouTube videos throughout the year. And if you donate $25 or more, you will automatically be entered in a drawing for a chance to win a 90-minute reading, a 60-minute reading, or one of my personalized moon shadow eclipse reports. As longtime listeners know, I love to thank my financial donors on the air over the next 12 months. If you do not want me to mention your name, please email me, april@bigskyAstrology.com. This week, we are thanking monthly donors Katie Serta and Leslie Wade. Leslie and Katie, thank you so much for listening and for supporting the show with your donations. And thanks very much to all of you for dropping in during the 6th annual Podathon. Join me again bright and early tomorrow morning for another episode. including an interview with psychological astrologer and therapist Margaret Gray. And until then, keep your feet on the ground and your eyes on the stars.
That's it for today. Don't forget to make your donation at bigskyastropod.com and join us each Labor Day weekday for another very special episode of the Big Sky Astrology Podcast.